Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. In this session we are basically looking at the influence of Buddhism on Babasaheb and his way of thinking, his writings and so on. So 2 years back I was doing a paper actually, and I was asked to basically review early Buddhist critique of caste and then compare it with what Babasaheb did in his writings. And that kind of came to me as a revelation, because when I was looking at his writings, especially his three major writings on caste, one was his talk which he delivered. It was a paper which he delivered in 1916 at the age of 25 in the anthropology seminar in New York. Second was his very famous speech which he could not deliver, but then which was printed later on in the speech which he was supposed to give in the Lahore in the Jat Pat Todak Mandal as a presidential address. In 1936 it was published in the form of a booklet, Annihilation of Caste. And of course the Buddha and his Dhamma, which was published posthumously in 1957, but a book on which he was working for a long period. So while studying those three pieces belonging to three different time periods, what I discovered is that Babasaheb's journey started as an anthropology or as a student of law, economics and so on, and so all social sciences basically, and then that continued till 1936. Even in the Annihilation of Caste, we see his analysis of caste and the problem done mainly from the point of view of social scientist, I must say. But there too he started actually talking about the role of religion, role of consciousness in in relation to the problem of caste. So in the Annihilation of Caste, he talks about different the mechanisms which are behind the working of the caste, and he spells out two major you can say factors responsible for the caste system. He said one is the caste consciousness, and second is the religious sanction and the he calls it like the role of shastras, the role of religious scriptures in imposing that kind of that conscious or inculcating those ideas in the mind of people. But in all these discussions, he doesn't talk much about Buddhism. He only refers once to Buddha and Nanak in that very famous talk on Annihilation of Caste. And there he says that as Buddha and Nanak not only challenged the scriptures, but also kind of encouraged people to fight against the ideologies of those scriptures. So that should be the way. That's what he hints at the Buddha and his what the Buddha was doing in his discourses. Now there are also several other issues which he discussed in these two articles, where he talks about how the caste came about, the genesis of caste, the mechanism of caste, its spread, and so on, evils of caste. Now, when he talks about the same issue in the Buddha and his Dhamma, it comes with a different dimension now. So he analyzes or tries to understand the whole issue of caste discrimination, making the Buddha's discourses as his basis, and that was such a shift in a way, because he is now approaching the whole issue of caste from Buddhist perspective. He tries to analyze caste, its features, which are very much on line with the Buddhist sutras, We all know that Asalayana or Isukari or the Vaseta Sutta and the Lohika Sutta. So these are the sutta which he himself also quotes in his Buddha and his Dhamma. And then through those suttas, he tries to bring out the features of caste systems, its effects, its the evils of caste systems, and so on, which he earlier discussed without that context in his earlier writings. So now it gives it a very a different turn to the entire discussion. It is interesting that the issues like the impact of caste on society. Now, if we look at the Buddhist suttas, we don't really find much discussion on what the caste is, the definition of caste. So there's not much discussion. It does talk about some features of caste system, like the graded inequality or kind of forced distribution of labor and so on and so forth. Things like also features like endogamy or prohibition of sharing knowledge and so on. So these are there reflected in the Buddhist suttas, but we don't really see a very fundamental discussion about what is caste. In fact, what we see is that there is a large confusion in terms of usage of words like varna, jati, gotra, kula, and so on. So I mean, these are some of the ideas which are, I think, still not well defined, so to say. Then there is not much discussion on how caste system came into being. Of course, we do have references to the divine origins of caste, which are the arguments of the Brahmins. And we also see some arguments like where the caste is said to be the result of, your birth in a particular caste is said to be the result of your karma. Now, this is what we find in the earlier suttas, but there's no real discussion on how the caste kind of comes into existence, how it spreads. Mangesh had earlier mentioned this mechanism of excommunication and also imitation and so on. So these were not really discussed in the earlier sutta. There's no awareness of these ideas. We do see, there's also not much discussion on the impact of this evil of caste system on the society, except a few references where in the Lohika Sutta, where the Buddha talks about how it deprives, a part of society from knowledge, and as a result, how it kind of deprives them of their right in the rightful share in the society. But apart from that, there's not much on the ethical, or you can say the other impacts of the caste system on the society. It is only argued that this is something unnatural, this is something which is not eternal law, it is something which is changeable, or it is not universal, and so on and so forth. But there is not much talk on the impact of caste on society. How it, as Mangesh was talking about in the morning, how caste kind of demoralizes society, a part of society which is suffering due to it, and so on. How it kind of does not allow social harmony, how it creates barriers in the society. So it does not really talk much about that. So now when Babasaheb takes all this in Buddha and his Dhamma, he actually draws those conclusions, or you can say draws those implications from the Buddhist sutras. From the very suttas which we have studied for many years, all these Asalayana, Isukari, Vaseta, these are very well-known discourses. But what Babasaheb does, he approaches these suttas from a point of view of a social scientist and anthropologist, and tries to bring out these implications. So he said that this is what something which Buddha implied, though he did not say it explicitly. And he said we can sense that from Buddha's the way he addressed people, the way he argued against the arguments of the Brahmins, and so on. Babasaheb took up the very two important factors responsible for caste, as he talked about in his famous speech of the initiation of caste. He takes that up in the Buddha and his Dhamma from the Buddhist perspective, and the Buddha's emphasis on mind, role of your thoughts in shaping your behavior and so on. So he takes that up to a great extent. He also talks about Buddha's approach to religious scriptures, how he challenged the ineffability of the scriptures, how he challenged the supremacy of the Vedas and the doctrines therein. So for Babasaheb, the line of thought which he was adopting earlier is something which goes along with what Buddha was doing. If we look at the way Buddha approached the whole issue, the way he tried to find out the remedies for the whole problem, we can see that on one hand he was challenging this, the arguments of the Brahmins on a very rational, logical grounds. He was trying to purify their notions, trying to cleanse their mind of those. So Buddha calls the notion of caste as one of the wrong views. So all these things which Buddha was doing on one hand, and on the other, what he created was a model of an ideal society in the form of a sangha. And in the sangha, if you just look at what measures he is adopting, he has adopted, of course, as we all know, the democratic model for the sangha's operation. There is ownership, common ownership. Then we see that the respect and all the reverence is done as per the seniority and not as per one's caste or birth. And measures such as going for alms to each and every house without any preference, distribution of food. So these are some of the remedies which are, though they were not directly mentioned, but they really strike at the roots of the caste system, because this is what caste denied: interdining, and you already know that the worth of a person was decided on the basis of his birth and not on the basis of his action. So all these things which the Buddha was doing. So on the two levels, on the theoretical level, he was trying to cleanse the mind of people of this evil ideas of caste, and on the other hand, he was creating a model. But it's also true that in spite of these efforts by the Buddha, he could not really bring that whole issue to a kind of logical conclusion, and could not really bring it into the day-to-day life of the people, because what he tried was applicable in the sphere of the Sangha, but he could not make it a law of the country. Even though Prasenajit, Kosala and Bimbisara were his good friends, he could not ask them to make it a law of the day. And I think what Babasaheb does, or what he did actually through his writings, he brought all these strings together from Buddha's writings. He gave them logical conclusions. So he draws in implications from Buddha's teachings, and so he gives them a kind of a conclusion, a logical conclusion of what Buddha was teaching. And through his political reforms, through his constitutional means, he tried to really bring that ideology into the common in the common sphere, where all those things are become accessible to each and everyone, not just for a limited community of renunciates. So I think I see that Babasaheb, he starts his journey as an anthropologist or social scientist, but then by the end of his journey, he grounds all that on a very solid foundation of Buddhism. In fact, if you look at also his social movements, he starts his social movements with where he's fighting for the rights of Dalits. But by the end of his career, he wants to create a new identity, a new consciousness for the oppressed people. You can see that when he started his journey, all his organizations which he established, the newspapers which he started, like Mukanayak, Bahishkrut Bharat and all that. So they all kind of echo this very notion of someone who has no voice, someone who is outcast, expelled. I mean, he's not a part of the society, and so on and so forth. But if you look at what he did at the end of his journey, all those he had a new newspaper which is called Prabuddha Bharat. So he tries to bring in that Buddhist identity. He established organizations like Buddhist Society of India and things like that. So his entire emphasis by the end of his career shifted to Buddhism, and it was firmly grounded on Buddhism. Now if you look at the way he composes Buddha and his Dhamma, very often, at the very early years when he composed when he wrote his book, he was criticized, and they said that instead of being called as the Buddha and his Dhamma, he should have been called as Ambedkar and his Dhamma. So people objected what Ambedkar has said in this book, not as a Buddha's teachings, but as a teaching of Dr. Ambedkar. So they thought that this is his own ideas. And but in fact, what we know and what the research has shown, that this is not really true. Parantananda Kausalan, whose name we have just mentioned in the morning, he was one of the persons who, when he translated his book in Hindi, he tried to provide references from the canonical text for what Babasaheb was trying to argue in Buddha and his Dhamma. But it is interesting that Parantananda Kausalan's references were limited to Pali, and by far this has been a kind of a idea or the notion in the mind of people that what actually Babasaheb relied on was simply Pali sources or the Theravada tradition. But what Vasant Moon later, in his supplement to the Buddha and Dhamma, he identified some more sources for his book, and he tried to show how Babasaheb has also used secondary materials like writings of Dharmananda Kosambi, his drama The Bodhisattva, and so on, and also time to time made use of certain other sources which were not purely Pali or Theravada sources. In our present research which we are doing, which Mangesh referred to, we also discovered that actually what Babasaheb is doing is he is using a lot of different sources from the Buddhist tradition, not sticking to one particular tradition. So when he's giving the biography of the Buddha, he's making lots of use of the Buddha Charita of Ashwagosha. He's also making lots of use of the Chinese Dhammapada, which is already mentioned actually in his, so it is not something new. So he has already mentioned that in the preface of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So he is making all sorts of, making use of all these different materials. And even though he has not mentioned any sources, because that the Buddha and Dhamma is not meant as a scholarly research work or something, it is meant as a gospel, as Babasaheb himself has mentioned, for people to people to know Buddhism, in a consistent form. So he's making use of different ideas from different traditions of Buddhism. So as Lokamitra was also mentioning, Babasaheb made use of paramitas, the ideas of paramitas and the Bodhisattva principle and so on. He was also making use of lots of the Theravada material in Pali. So he grounded his entire discussion on this. In fact, there is one more thing which is worth pointing. This Babasaheb's distinction or actually classification of the teachings or any kind of you can say religious teaching into the three categories of adharma, dharma and saddharma. Now this is very much on the lines of what we see in the Mahayana Sutras, where we talk about also dharma and also saddharma. But what Babasaheb is doing is that he is giving it a different context. So where dharma is more individualistic, you can say saddharma is more social. more communal in the sense. It connects to the entire community, not just individual. So he's using those categories, I mean just the names of those categories, but trying to give it a new meaning which is relevant to his time. As I mentioned to you, I mean, if you look at Babasaheb's use of materials, he is not, he's not sticking to any one particular tradition. And I think in that sense, as Lokamitraji was also mentioning, he is very close to the Sangrakshita's approach, where he also does not stick to any particular tradition of Buddhism, but he rather talks about Buddhism as a whole. So I think Babasaheb also has that kind of approach in his mind, and he also brings in all that different material. So whatever suits, whatever suits his idea of social reformation, and whatever kind of is helpful for building up a new Buddhist society, I think Babasaheb was open to all those ideas. So when we talk about influence of Buddhism on Babasaheb, it is not the influence of one particular tradition of Buddhism on Babasaheb, but it was rather influence of the holistic Buddhism, if I can use that word. He's using, that's the impact of the holistic Buddhism on him. And that's the reason why when it is said that it is reported that when he was asked that which kind of Buddhism he is converting to, he said that he is not really going to convert to any particular yana, no Shravaka yana or Mahayana or Theravada, but he says it's a new yana, it's a new path, and this new path is actually the path of the holistic Buddhism. And I think that really gives us a vision for modern understanding of Buddhism. And I think Sangharakshita, when Sangharakshita was really a pioneer in this field, when he took Buddhism from that holistic point of view. And I think Babasaheb was also sharing that very vision of holistic Buddhism. And I think that's also needed when people are really divided into Mahayana and now people don't talk much about Mahayana, but we talk about Chinese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, this Buddhism, that Buddhism. So Buddhism is kind of got divided into many different things. But what Babasaheb was really talking about was more holistic or universal notions of Buddhism, which are fundamental to any Buddhist practice. So what we see is that in all his actions, in his writings of Buddha and Dhamma, or his vision of India, when he said that his dream is to make India Bauddhamay, that is Buddhist, what he was kind of again probably meaning was to bring those Buddhist ideals, Buddhist values in Indian society, and he was the one who, as we all know, that instrumental in bringing all those Buddhist symbols, Buddhist flag, Ashoka Chakra on the Indian flag, and many other symbolisms which he brought in the Indian polity. It was all because of Babasaheb that we could get all this Buddhist identity, even though people hardly recognize it, but it is very much there. Now, what we are doing also at the department, let me talk, for a few minutes on that, is kind of bring that message of Buddhism to our people. Just Mangesh have just now said that in our department we are dealing with the Pali, we are dealing with the Buddhist Sanskrit sources, Tibetan, Chinese. So if we really want to move ahead, we need to, I think, bring that kind of holistic approach in Buddhist studies when we take that ahead, because that is something which Babasaheb also envisioned for us. One more thing is that when people talk about Babasaheb nowadays, we talk about his social message. But as Lokamitraji has said, there is so much the Dhamma element in his writings which people often ignored. Babasaheb, when he wrote Buddha and Dhamma, he was worried because he said that authors who were writing about Buddhism were basically talking about its philosophical aspects or from the meditation aspect of Buddhism, but nobody was talking about the social aspect of Buddhism. And that was one of the motivations for him to write the book, Buddha and Dhamma. Now I think when people study Buddha and Dhamma, they sometimes go to the other extreme and they're saying that Buddha and Dhamma is only social, so the Buddhism is only social, and there is no element of mental development there. There's not much about one's spiritual development. But I mean, again, if that is the way, then we are again following another extreme. So from that point of view also, I mean, I think we really need to study Buddha and Dhamma very seriously, and to look into both the aspects of this text, and which he connects with Buddha's own teaching. And I think from that point of view also, I mean, I always appreciate the approach which Triratna overall has. It combines the social theories as well, I mean, the social message of the Buddha, also with the message of the Dhamma, which is very much there. And I think in case of Babasaheb writing also, if we study Babasaheb from just one-sided, our study will be one-sided. We need again to take a more holistic approach when we study Babasaheb, and also to focus on what he is saying in these chapters where he discusses the Dhamma and Sadhamma notions of Buddhism. So overall, what we see is that Babasaheb's journey, which began as a social scientist, ends with a person who is very much grounded in the religion, I mean, in the Dhamma. And as he said, if morality has to last long, then it needs, it needs that sanction. Not sanction, but it should be grounded on religion, because that then brings some kind of emotional affiliation to what you are following. So morality cannot be enforced by law, but it has to come from within. And if it really has to come from within, then it has to be rooted in the religion. And then he goes on actually examining what religion does that best. And as we know, that his conclusion was, of course, Buddhism. So Buddhism is and was always kind of remained a strong foundation for him in all his discussions from 1935 or that time onwards. And I think the Buddha and the Dhamma was really a culmination of his entire reflection on Buddhism. And I think what we are doing there, I mean, earlier we had a question regarding differences in different Buddhist affiliation, Buddhist groups. They are not one, they are not united, and so on. But what we see is that, I mean, there are these different organizations, they are having different outlooks. But I think the places like the university, where people from different affiliations come together, get to know each other, get to know each other's perspective. And I think through the words of the Buddha, through the Pali scriptures, through the Buddhist scriptures, they understand, I think, each other better. So departments like us, the departments of Pali and Buddhist studies here, are not just serving as platforms for academic research, but they are actually serving as places where people can come together. And all these different Buddhist groups, they come together. Sometimes I've experienced that in classrooms they have clashes with each other, they have arguments, but I think there's a dialogue. So such places can really become important centers where all these things can discuss freely, and people can come under one roof of Buddhism. And I think this is where we have our role. And from this very point of view, we are actually organizing our departments at Pune and different courses. Mangesh also mentioned about this course on Engaged Buddhism, which we also started in collaboration with the Triratna, with the Manuski Center and the people there. And what we see is that people are really exploring now. Our Buddhist people are exploring the engaged approach of the Buddha. But at the same time, they are also now understanding the importance of mental cultivation and self-development, and to connect it with the social development. So we are trying to kind of provide that context to Babasaheb's writing, and we are trying to kind of now bring into action what Babasaheb envisaged through his writings. in the Buddha and his Dhamma. So this is one thing which we are doing through our courses. One last thing which I would like to mention, let me somehow try to connect with this one question which was asked in the morning. We had this individual persons who were trying to engage with Buddhism, like Anand Kaushalayan and Bhikshu Jagdish Kashyap and so on. But their journey basically started as an individual journey. But in case of Babasaheb, I think his journey was, in a way, throughout, kind of, he always did that journey, keeping the whole society in his mind, and rather than keeping it to himself for his individual progress, individual liberation, he was always thinking about Buddhism as a tool for the social emancipation. And I think this is where the difference lies. I mean, even though there are many individuals who got attracted to Buddhism in those early days, but their main motives were individualistic rather than social. And I think this is where we can really see the difference. I think with this, let me stop here, and maybe we can discuss something more when we come to the actual discussion point. So, thank you.